In this tutorial, we're going to explore a critical part of contemporary and agile project management, what I'm going to call project development strategy. In most references to project management, it is almost forgotten, yet it is a critical point in a project planning process which involves people such as your sponsors and your critical stakeholders as to how you're going to break the project up. How are we going to box this project into clumps, if you can let me use that language? Those Agilists amongst you will also come across terms like release planning and program increments in the SAFe approach, which are synonyms for this broader strategy. However, when you look at both SAFe and other Agile models, there is very little guideline into how to do that strategy, how to do that breaking of the project up into releases or program increments. And to understand this, we're going to go back to the future. And I'm going to show you this little book here, which is basically called Software Engineering Techniques. And I'd like you to sit down for a sec, because you probably will, and I'm going to tell you when this book was published. That is 1969. Not 1979, 89, this is 1969. In those days, despite a lot of people's misunderstanding, large-scale project system development had been in operation since the late 50s. In fact, in 1958, over 1,000 people were working on a project called the SAGE project for the US Defense Department, which developed a number of massive innovations in computer development. So by 1968, there was a substantial 15-year history in building large and complex systems. And in this conference, because there was no Australian Computer Society or American Computer Society, NATO got together the finest brains in the world relevant to that period in building large systems and just documented their conversations. And in particular, there's a conversation from a guy called Edward David, who was the key software developer for Bell Labs, which was a major innovator in computing in the 60s and late 50s. And in this, David says, it is our experience that if you can't break a large system into elements that can be built by 4 to 5 people within 6 to 12 months, that project will never be successful. That statement was made in 1968. So the concept of breaking large projects into smaller elements is decades old. It just simply is that people constantly forget this model. I came across the idea of time boxing, for example, when I was working at AT&T, in effect Bell Labs, where they had a principle that you broke projects up into 6 to 9 month increments. That was in 1981. So this concept of partitioning is decades old. What I want to explore with you is how to approach the partitioning. And we implemented this in a major client a number of years ago very successfully. So if you come back to our O3 model, you'll have a series of outputs that all lead to a specific outcome. You'll all know that by now. What we're looking at is, do we break those outputs into smaller outputs? And if we do, how do we cluster some of them together to create a shorter time frame, say let's say 6 months, to get something out quicker than building all the outputs in one clump? Of course, Agile simply takes that to a much stronger extreme by actually not doing 6 to 12 months, but by doing it in 2 to 3 weeks and those things. But ultimately, the same concept applies, which is this. How do you determine out of all the outputs and all the sub-outputs, or all the epics and all the user stories and features, which is the most optimum way of clustering some of those together to get something useful within an agreed period of time? That's strategy. Now, we have a model, and we're going to have some information for you at the end of this tutorial where you can look at this, which says if you're looking at partitioning up a project into releases or into program increments or into what I call time boxes, then you've got different lenses to look at in making that decision. There's about 15 of them altogether. But for example, the question you'd be asking is, can we assemble some of these components together that optimizes client impact? Or can we combine them together that optimizes technology dependencies between projects? In other words, to prove them early. Can we do it to, for example, impact change management? By clustering a certain group together, you may actually make the change management process harder, or you can make it easier. You can look at how you can do clustering to mitigate risk, project risk that is. So by combining some of these, you'll either lower or raise the risk. And if you've got an experienced team, for example, you might want to look at the release or the partition based on what are some of the simplest, easier stories or easier components we can package together so the team can build something, get it out quickly, and build some confidence. You could look at financing constraints. You could look at how do you partition these particular components into a time box that actually deals with funding, working under a funding constraint. So there's a number of different lenses. And the whole idea is simply this. Once you've got your O3, once you've done your risk assessment, you can sit down with preferably the sponsor, but certainly some architects, some key team members, product owner, or other very knowledgeable subject matter experts, and simply look at the O3 and say, now let's look at if we partitioned it according to this lens, let's look at it if we partition to this lens. And as you keep looking at the O3 from different lenses, what will emerge is the optimum combination of either user stories, features, or sub-outputs into a package or a release or a time box. And that's the model. Again, at the end of the video, we'll give you a full list of some of those lenses. One final point on this, which is this whole idea of strategy versus tactics. The debate about Agile and Waterfall is a tactical debate. And irrespective of whether you're going to go Agile or Waterfall, the higher level partitioning is a mandatory and critical part of project management.